All right. So, Mark, we're 5 after. We've got 35 folks on the call. I think we're good to start.
I was just about to say the same thing, Ben. Well, I just want to welcome everybody. First of all, my name is Mark McDonald. For those of you I don't know, I am the president of the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation, which is Georgia's statewide nonprofit historic preservation organization. And we just want to thank you all for joining us to talk about this important topic. I'm so sorry we cannot be live and in person because that's the way we get to know all of you a little bit better and to build our network, which is something that I think we're all trying to do, is to identify the people in the state who really care about African-American historic preservation and build a stronger network, a stronger voice for that. So we promise we're going to try to do our best to get all the email addresses and try to do that as virtually as we can, and maybe gather just as soon as we possibly can again in person. I do want to thank the Williams Family Foundation in Thomasville, Georgia, and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. They have funded a lot of the work that the Georgia Trust is doing in this space and in these seminars we're doing. We're really fortunate, of course, to be working in Georgia, where we have a strong voice from the National Park Service. We're going to hear from Keilah later, and from the Historic Preservation Division of the Department of Community Affairs, but also to have so much African-American history in our state that needs to be preserved. We've got, just to mention a few themes, and we're going to get deeper into this, we've got within our state significant places of enslavement and oppression. We have Reconstruction after the Civil War sites. We have a plethora of early Black institutions of higher learning in our state. Have a lot of existing Rosenwald schools and I think a very robust effort to preserve Rosenwald schools. And of course, we have early civil rights history and all the way through the history of the civil rights movement up to current events, of course. So it's really our duty to preserve these places, these sites, for future generations. The Black Lives Matter movement and Black History movement is only a new movement in popular culture, because I just want to point out that dedicated African-American history scholars and preservation advocates have been doing this kind of work for many years. People like Melissa Jest and Keilah Spann on the call have been working on this for a long time. So we're going to go until 12 o'clock today, and then we're going to take a break until 1:30. So we're just going to log off and then log back in using the Zoom link at 1:30, and we'll all get back together. Also have a few more housekeeping notes just to go over with you all. We do want you all, if you would, please, to mute yourselves unless you're speaking, to cut down on background noise, and just to ensure that we have the best audio experience for everyone. And we will have time for questions and answers after each presentation. And at that time, we will call upon anyone who has questions and take them one at a time. And I think Danielle, if I'm not mistaken, is going to moderate that part of it. Danielle Meunier, one of our staff members at the Trust. You're also welcome to use the chat feature during the presentations to ask questions if something comes up that needs to be clarified. And I think Danielle's going to try to take note of those and interject them when it's appropriate. And very importantly, this workshop will be recorded in its entirety, and we will share a copy of the recording with you all following the conclusion of the workshop today. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Melissa Jest, who is the African American History Programs Manager at the Historic Preservation Division of the Department of Community Affairs. Melissa, take it away, please.
Good morning. Thank you for that. And good morning to everyone. Glad to be with you. As Mark mentioned, I am here at the Georgia Historic Preservation Office. You might also hear us referred to as HPD, the Historic Preservation Division. And I coordinate the African American programs. And these Programs include field surveying and documenting historic places that tell of our life and presence here in Georgia. It includes managing a graduate assistantship, working with students at Georgia State University and their Heritage Preservation Program, as well as working with the Georgia African American Historic Preservation Network. We call it GOPN for short. And this is a network of about over 2,000 people who receive our Reflections newsletter, which I also edit. But most importantly, I provide technical assistance to individuals and groups, individuals like yourself, who are planning and implementing historic preservation programs. And next slide. I have someone doing the tech for me so that I don't blow up the tech for us. But at the HPD, I work within the outreach office. And there I work to implement outreach strategies to engage underrepresented communities and bring more diverse participation in preservation activities around the state. And so this work brings me in contact with constituents throughout the 159 counties. And so I have to take a moment and recognize and thank you all for your service and your commitment to preserving history here in Georgia, and specifically history that tells of African and African-American presence. My work supports HPD's overall mission, which you see here on the screen. And I also want to note that my observations and opinions that I'm going to share with you today do not necessarily reflect those of Georgia HPD, the Georgia Department of Community Affairs, our umbrella agency, its director, our commissioner, or staff. Next slide. According to the National Trust for Historic Preservation, preservation opportunities surround us because the bulk of America's building stock in our towns and our cities are historic in age, 50 years or older, as well as having significance historically to American history. However, only a few of these buildings, in comparison to the larger environment, use preservation tools and programs. So this particular slide shows you 4 major cities here in the US as a quick example. So we see Washington, DC, the nation's capital, has a higher preservation ethic because they have a higher number of buildings that are listed either on the National Register or on the local register that they manage there in the district. But when we look at some of the other cities as examples, the preservation ethic is not really that strong. You know, they haven't listed their buildings on the National Register or considered them as historic assets for reuse. And so what we're here to do is kind of ponder, well, why is that? We can list a number of pitfalls that seem to inhibit, preservation's, acceptance by all of our public, whether it's restrictive standards for nominating a property, or whether it's the cost and in time and money that it takes to do preservation, or that preservation only seems to put energy into the high style or the uber unique properties that can meet museum level conditions. Georgia has nearly 84,000 historic resources listed on the National Register of Historic Places, making Georgia among the top 10 states when it comes to historic registration properties. Georgia also leads the state in the number of certified local governments, which we'll talk a little bit more about under the fundraising section. And so Georgia pretty much is a leader when you think about some of the preservation tools, the National Register, certified local governments. However, less than 9% of those resources on the National Register are African-American resources, or more importantly, their significance heavily depends on the ethnic heritage and significance of that particular district. So less than 9% of those 84,000 resources in Georgia tell of our story, while Georgia has a 31% Black population. So why is that? So it may be that this preservation is a challenge overall, as we see with this particular slide, or there may be some other barriers, and that's what hopefully I'm going to be touching on a few. Next slide, please. Thanks to the Georgia Trust for inviting me to present some of my observations and thoughts on the barriers that might be impeding that number in terms of African-American resources undergoing preservation or being promoted to the public as worthy of preservation. And also, thank you for your interest in understanding the barriers and hopefully identifying some in your work and being a part of overcoming them and reducing them. I must declare to you, though, that I am not a historian. So I've been working in preservation for 20 years. And what I do understand is that a majority of the Black history here in Georgia is influenced by the history of the American slave system here in the US, and influenced by the experience of the African ancestors that were targeted and used by that system. And it is my observation that many of the barriers to preserving historic resources that tell of those ancestors' experience and contributions, those barriers also stem from that history of the American slavery system. The traditional view of Blacks and our role in American society continues to shape how people value or devalue Black people, Black spaces, Black stories. In response, Black people continue to exhibit resilience, however, continue to exhibit ingenuity as we struggle to maintain our homes, our institutions, and our humanity. Next slide. So we'll start with our first barrier. Historic designation, listing on the National Register, listing on a local register, or both, often are the first step in attempting to save, preserve, reuse historic resources. However, with African-American resources, this is where we encounter our first barrier, the lack of requisite documentation. National Register nominations, local register nominations require documents, they require proof. So while the 1966 National Preservation Act and the National Register that was created by that act do not overtly address race, it does require documentation that often doesn't exist because of past racially biased, racially based policies that enabled local governments not to record Black life, not to record Black land ownership. So it was legal to exclude us from documentation. So those particular papers, those stories, those articles, those items that you need to document when you are nominating a property don't necessarily exist. They're not readily available. Now, local designation by your own local historic review board, which we'll talk a little bit about later, may offer an opportunity for significant Black sites to be designated locally by your Historic Preservation Commission. However, a lot of those commissions use the National Register standards. Therefore, we're back to this particular barrier of meeting their standard of documentation required to be designated. Next slide. So we'll go into a little case study with each of our barriers just to see how it's manifesting, in real life here on the ground. This is a photograph of Miss Viney's cabin. Miss Viney was enslaved by Elijah Field, and she worked as a cook. She also labored in the house and in the fields that he owned in Bartow County. Her cabin stands behind the family house in Cartersville, Georgia. Local lore dates the cabin to about 1855, but there are few, if any, documents that exist specifically stating when this particular cabin was built. So without proof, the owner is struggling to gain acceptance and support from local entities because there is no specific time date for this particular resource. He also is struggling in terms of planning for the rehabilitation of this particular property because without a time date and without a significant story, he's not able to get folks and professionals interested to come out and help him do the necessary assessment on this particular property. Now, meanwhile, he's also doing the rehabilitation on the main house. the larger property where the Field family lived. And so here we have a case where this important vernacular structure is competing for attention, competing for the time and resources, competing with the larger house that has documentation. The owner was able to go to the courthouse and find the necessary records about the field house because that life, the majority life, was documented. So along with the burden of truth, vernacular resources like Ms. Viney's cabin, must compete. And being hamstringed without having those documents often lead to the loss of these important types of structures. Next slide. So to overcome or surmount this burden of proof, I encourage constituents that I work with to use oral history to fill in the informational or documentation gap. As elders say, tell the truth and shame the devil. So that's the first recommendation I would make to those listening here. Investigate oral history collection. Investigate the standards that exist for that. There are guidelines that can help you do a good project. And there are entities that may be even interested in housing those oral histories, whether they're audio or video, so that other researchers can find that resource. So it has become the go-to methodology and reference source for researching and documenting African-American places. And they're being accepted as the necessary reference for your designation applications. When you do apply to the National Register, offices are accepting oral histories. But again, there are standards for recording those. There are recommendations on how to ask those questions. And so that is kind of the first step I would suggest to constituents whenever they're looking at doing preservation. Talk with those elders in the community that have memory and information about those sites that you are looking to save. Next slide. So oral history collection was very instrumental in the preservation project here at West Hunter Street Baptist Church in Atlanta. And Keilah Spann, who will be following me with her presentation, will talk a little bit more about this particular project. But I wanted to show one particular site of significance here that did use oral history in its preservation plan. Next slide. Next slide. So, and also another example where oral history made a difference in the designation on the National Register was that small white schoolhouse that we saw in the previous slide. That was the Cherry Grove School in Wilkes County. A group worked for 10 years to get that particular location on the National Register. And it was the oral histories that they collected. They were able to interview Nancy Cohen Gumby, who taught in the school. They were also able to interview the descendants of the late Mr. West Weems, who helped to build the school. And so this particular property is now on the National Register as well as on the Georgia Register. And again, oral history made the difference in filling in the gaps that reviewers had in terms of documenting the building date and the building's history over time. Thank you. So next slide. All right, so the next barrier, the second barrier I want to point to dates back more so to more recent history, post World War II, when housing policies were passed with specific racial codes and covenants that forbid builders who were receiving government financing and realtors from selling to African-American citizens. So these policies are institutionalized. They're long-standing kind of traditions now within how a lot of policy, housing policy, local, state, and federal still operate. They still make the foundation that the discriminatory, the legalization of that discrimination still kind of affects policies we deal with today. And so, and our African-American in neighborhoods are affected by this disinvestment, by this tradition of seeing African-American neighborhoods as less, therefore justifying disinvestment, therefore justifying taking your monies and your attention, the public monies and attention elsewhere. It was similar policies that justified the withdrawal of public funding from the urban core, from majority African-American neighborhoods. And also it was this similar type of tradition of discrimination that directed urban renewal initiatives in the 50s and 60s that starved out minority communities and literally abolished or demolished them. And so now bringing it forward to today with the globalization, with investment and interest coming from around the world into our urban neighborhoods, negative pressure on Black neighborhoods and Black business corridors have multiplied exponentially and have found Black owners and residents still hobbled by the effects of the exclusionary traditions of redlining dating back to World War II. So they're really unable to fight this new heightened interest and this new heightened pressure. Next slide. So our case study here in terms of this barrier of disinvestment is the Herndon building, named for, I should say, millionaire Alonzo Herndon, who built it in 1924. It sits on Auburn Avenue, one of America's most successful African-American business corridors. The building and many others on Auburn Avenue experienced disinvestment like many other places of African-American significance on business corridors around the state. And it was disinvestment on the part of the city in terms of withdrawing services like maintenance of streetscapes, lighting, and regular communication and support of owners of these particular properties that led to further deterioration of this structure. Majority of these business corridors, as I mentioned, saw development and investment go out to the sprawling suburbs, as banks and financiers lent their money to new construction outside of the historic business core. Next slide. So many say that the building, suffered ravages of disinvestment by the owner itself. But it is my observation that public officials have a role in supporting, especially those cities and counties that have preservation ordinances and preservation programs. It is their responsibility to find ways to activate those owners or support those owners to ensure that historic business corridors, historic neighborhoods, historic African-American resources are able to stand, are maintained. So instead of property maintenance being the enemy that comes in at the last minute to demolish your structure, it can be an ongoing relationship where property maintenance and code enforcement keeps you informed on how to best maintain your structure according to city codes. Auburn Avenue is also a National Historic Landmark District, having achieved the highest level of designation here in our nation. And so there is also an opportunity or a partnership with the National Park Service and its federal and its offices. We have an office here in Atlanta to help owners understand the resource that they have, the significance of the resource, and therefore have that inform their ability or hopefully motivate them to maintain those particular properties. And so this story is common, unfortunately, in our historic Black business corridors. The Herndon building was demolished in 2008. There are other corridors that are also suffering around the state that you all might be aware of, such as the Broad Street corridor in the Harrisburg, National Register District in Augusta, Jackson Street in the Harlem community in Albany, and West Broad Street, which is the western boundary for the Savannah Landmark District in Savannah, Georgia. Next slide. And so I offer to you to overcome that particular barrier, to persist Continue to organize. So that's the P in preservation, persistence. And persistence is how African Americans have found our success in America historically. And also, that's how we have won our battles one step at a time in the face of legalized disenfranchisement. Next slide. Lillian Davis of the Hubbard Alumni Association agrees with me that persistence is key in overcoming disinvestment or the effort to ignore African American resources. She says, quote, "We just had to keep saying it. We know this school is important to us and it should be important to everyone," in speaking about the Hubbard School. Once the group organized, the Hubbard Association joined the local Chamber of Commerce. And they kept talking about the school and how important the site was. The school is located in Forsyth, Georgia, Monroe County. This particular group began holding public events like a parade. I think the last one they held was in April of 2019. They established a scholarship fund and kept promoting the legacy of Hubbard School. They still give out those scholarships, and that program began in 1986. So they've been doing this for a while. And so these are all strategies to help preserve the legacy, but also to bring attention to the need to preserve the physical campus, which was the first vocational school for Blacks. And today, the Monroe County Workforce Development Center is housed in this particular building, the old Hubbard Teacher Cottage. And it's been in that building since 2014. And it helps hundreds of people there in the county by providing a myriad of social services aimed at young and old alike to obtain skills training so that they can find better jobs and improve their standard of life. Next slide. The Hubbard alumni and the Monroe County Commission, specifically Larry Evans, he is a Hubbard alumni and a county commissioner. He served as an ambassador to keep the association's partnership proposal alive while they were negotiating. He was continuing to sell the vision, sell the usefulness of the buildings. You're looking here at their historic dormitory structure. And so within the last few years, the commission has purchased the dormitory here and plans to, again, house more government agencies as well as a Hubbard museum. In 2019, the Georgia Trust Ramble visited the campus. And so the Alumni Association continues to advocate before local institutions like the school board as well as the commission to be collaborative in their efforts to continue to use the buildings that remain on this particular campus. Next slide. Our third barrier is based really in our perception. It's a fact that the historic preservation field is a majority white field. Labor statistics say that African Americans only represent 4% of those employed in preservation. And preservation remains a majority white movement, with many nonprofit organizations with preservation as its core mission reporting a struggle to attract and retain diverse participants. So this low level of diverse representation in preservation gives the impression to the larger public that preservation is just not something Black people do. But I offer to you that preservation, preserving what we have, is all we know to do, given the barriers that we have faced in almost every aspect of our life here in America. Next slide. So a case study in Black people doing preservation is represented here at Andersonville National Cemetery here in Georgia. The National Park Service recently did a study that confirmed that Black enslaved labor built the camp, the buildings, the fortifications, dug the graves of those buried there. But most importantly, the study also documented that Black freed people commemorated and cared for these headstones and burial sites of the soldiers who were held captive here at Andersonville. They commemorated and cared for those headstones starting as early as 1868. So this practice was called Decoration Day, where the freedmen and women and children would come out, take care of, clean the headstones, and also decorate them as best they could with a ribbon or a bow, and commemorate the sacrifice of the men buried there. And they, again, did this for about 100 years. The practice ended in the late 1960s. However, that story of Black participation in building this site and Black preservation and commemoration of this site was never told at the site. And so there's an effort now to update that interpretation, to tell more of the story, to zoom out and show that Black people not only built the site and began commemorating and taking care of the site as early as 1868, but also to tell more of the story about the freed schools that were established on this particular site and the freed men and women and children who lived there and attended those schools. Next slide. And so how do we get over this misperception that Black folks don't do preservation? So given the tradition of limiting African-American access to mainstream resources, we have a history of not being able to be educated, not being able to get certain jobs, our neighborhoods being redlined and not being able to have access to financing. Given that tradition, Black folks have had to work within their own networks, right, to meet their needs, to solve their problems. And while such ingrained habits of exclusion still kind of linger in our cities and in our communities, and the challenge still lingers even amongst groups, and when we try to work together, African Americans are continuing to reach out. And so that's how we kind of surmount this perception that preservation is not what we do. We gotta reach out. If they're not coming to us, we gotta reach out and ask the question. But there is kind of still a rub there, because there's a need to change people's minds. There's a need to shift the paradigm towards inclusion, towards reaching out, towards talking more to those who may not look like you, but still may have an interest in your project. And also recognizing the need for sensitivity when we engage. You got to look at different ways to engage different people, right? Next slide, please. So in this particular barrier, I want to offer the Powell Family Homestead, which sits not too far from downtown Stone Mountain. And it is pressed on the north and west sides by parking lots and large development. So that's the residential character of the neighborhood is changing. So the family decided to sell, but rather than go through just the regular market process, putting a for sale sign, getting a realtor, they turned to their church. Again, turning within your network. They turned to their church for help to identify a buyer for their homestead, their historic cottage here. And so the trustees of their home church, the Keilah Baptist Church in Stone Mountain, they identified a local nonprofit organization that owned property next door. And that was actually running a community arts center not too far from the Powell House. This nonprofit turned Stone Mountain's brick trolley barn into that community arts center. And so in lieu of preservation covenants, the church and the family entrusted the nonprofit's demonstrated preservation ethic as benefiting their house, ensuring that their house would continue to stand and their house would continue to be a part of the landscape. Next slide. And so that circle in the lower right shows you where the Powell House sits. And right across the street is that community arts center that the nonprofit runs there in Stone Mountain. And so the director envisioned the Powell House turning into an artist in residence location to support their community arts mission. perfect. The artist would be exhibiting or performing in the center here to the left, and then be staying at the artist in residence house, which is formerly the Powell family house. And so he just had so many great ideas, but then he was sad because he says, I'm going to have to hire a researcher to find out the history of the house. And I'm going to, because if I want to interpret and tell the story, I'm going to need park ranger. Again, back to that documentation challenge. And so he's already anticipating going outside of the community, going outside to look for someone to tell him about this structure, tell him about the Powell house. And I give you that pause there is because, again, we have this assumption Black folks don't do preservation, so I can't earn to them. That's not true. That's what I shared with him when we spoke. I said, go to the church. The church came to you. They brokered the deal. They saw your preservation ethic. They entrusted you with this asset. You can go right back to them and say, now, can you share with me the history of the structure? The family turns to the church and say, help us. We want to find a sensitive buyer. The family is still engaged. Turn to the family and say, hey, what do you guys know about the history of this structure? You don't have to go outside first. Turn inward, turn inside, so that this particular project, it goes beyond just being brick and mortar preservation, but it now is an opportunity to connect this city that suffers from that division. And to bring the new paradigm of inclusion and cooperation and engagement. Next slide. So as I wrap up, I offer the biggest obstacle, the biggest barrier is us. I should say our mindsets. As we perpetuate these misperceptions and repeat these exclusionary practices. The writers of the National Preservation Act kind of inferred and tells us that preservation is about people and about who we are or who we were in time. So here on the screen, you can read for yourself there. They're talking about valuing what buildings tell us about ourselves, what these places tell us about ourselves. And they also talk about a concept that our ancestors already was considering, which is reaching back to help as you look forward. Sankofa, a West African term that talks about that concept of learning history, learning from the strength of our ancestors and using that knowledge to save and reuse the places, spaces, and stories that they built to take us forward. So I offer to you that preservation is Sankofa. So please hold on to your questions, note them in the chat. I would like to now throw it back to Mark so we can hear our next presenter. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. My video screen has gone blank, so I'm not able to see anything but your last slide. But that was a great presentation. And so we're now fortunate to hear from Keilah Spann. There we go. Hello, Keilah.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
Looking forward to hearing you. Keilah works for the National Park Service, and she's been a key partner of all of ours, especially the Georgia Trust. And we're just so glad to have you with us today, Keilah. So look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everyone. Once again, my name is Keilah Spann. I work with the National Park Service here in the Southeast region at Martin Luther King National Historic Park as their culture resource chief. This is a fairly new position for me, but I've worked with the Park Service for nearly 10 years now in some capacity, either in planning or as a historian. And most of that time has been spent working with the National Heritage Area Program on the federal end and also on the nonprofit end. Before I move forward, I want to make sure everyone can hear me. My screen is frozen. So can everyone hear me, and can everyone see the slideshow on the screen? Because I cannot.
You are a little bit quiet. You come and
Okay.
go. But we hear most of you, but we don't see your slides yet. So maybe Danielle can work on that for us.
All right, is this better in terms of sound?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so we don't see your slides, Keilah. If you want to try resharing your screen. Is it giving you the option to share your screen?
Yes.
Okay.
And just in case, were they also on Melissa's presentation?
Yes, I believe I have a copy of them if needed.
Okay, that might be easier if you don't mind, Danielle.
Okay.
And I'll just point out that while you all are working through the technical stuff, we did have a request in the chat box that if any folks are active on Twitter, if you wanted to add your handle there into the chat box so that folks could build community sort of outside of the singular workshop and use that social media platform as a way to connect.
Okay, and I think we are good to go. Thank you so much, Danielle. So good morning, everyone. I'm glad that Melissa ended her segment with the West African concept of Sankofa, which literally translates to go back and fetch what you forgot, because I'm going to touch a little bit about the differences between Western and African or Eastern views on cultural resource and cultural resource management. As Melissa pointed out earlier, one of the barriers to working with African American communities in the field of preservation is the assumption that African Americans are not interested in preserving their historic resources. This negative and paternalistic view ignores the differences in the way cultures view preservation. Next slide, please. In general, African Americans have Eastern or still maintaining an African view of cultural heritage that focuses more on the intangible evidence as a resource. So it is the ideology, the spirituality, the cultural value, the commemoration of events or an individual that is more important as opposed to preserving the tangible resource. Next slide, please. The physical aesthetics of an object and maintaining that aesthetic is not as important. That is because the material object has no value or no significance unless and until it is being used to promote, relay, recall the intangible resource. So as an example, I have here on the slide an Aquaba or an Ashanti fertility doll. You may visit a home or place in Ghana and see a Aquaba that is exquisitely carved and hundreds of years old. And you'll see it just sitting exposed to the elements in an unair conditioned environment. And as a preservation professional, you may get concerned about the condition of the wood and whether or not it's being maintained or maintaining the current patina and aesthetics. But the owner of that doll would not focus on any of these because the doll is not relevant unless it is being used by a member of the family or community to which it belongs to symbolize the importance of fertility and a community continuing to survive through the birth of children. What is significant or what is of value is not the doll itself, it's not the tangible. It is the intangible which the doll symbolizes. It's the continuation of life and community that is significant, and that is actually considered the resource. Next slide, please. So this is a focus that often we overlook or we don't understand, that for some cultures it's not so much the physical as it is the intangible that the physical represents that is the resource. That's what is considered worth preserving or maintaining. And as to methods of preservation, for African and Eastern cultures, a main method of preservation has been the griot, or the oral historian. And this could be through accompanying music or pictures. But this is a main method of preservation that is often overlooked here in the United States. And Melissa gave a great example of that in her talk earlier. Next slide, please. The recitation of history and passing down of cultural memory is a method that has survived throughout the African American experience in America. Where there is a tradition of oral history in place, then it allows for ritual to continue, which is another form of preservation that we often overlook. This honors the intangible resource and makes sure that the significance of the resource is passed down from time to time, generation to generation. And on the slide, I have an example from North Louisiana. This is from King River, and this is within the King River National Heritage Area's boundaries. This is at St. Augustine Church and Cemetery. All Souls Day is an important historic event that is celebrated en masse in this community. Creoles of African descent come back to the King River area from all over the world to remember the history of their ancestors that are interred there at the cemetery, and to continue to pass on the oral histories and values. So while I was working with the heritage area, we did a lot of efforts to preserve the cemetery, but what the community wanted us to focus on more so than our efforts was to make sure that they were able to continue the ritual and the rituals and oral histories that was critical for them to make sure that they continued their culture and their way of life. Next slide, please. Learning and accepting this difference in perspective has helped with planning and programming for our sites. Prior to this current position, I was working with the regional office here in Atlanta on a special resource study. And special resource studies are evaluations that Congress will designate the Park Service to undertake to determine whether or not a site will become a new unit of the National Park site. There are 4 criteria that are used in these studies to evaluate a site. They are the national significance of the site, the suitability of a site to be a national park, the feasibility of the national park to be, of the site to be a national park. That means how much money it would take for the federal government to operate it as a park, and the need for the National Park Service to manage it or to have it staffed. And I have national significance highlighted because that's the first and foremost important criteria that a study will have to evaluate and that a site will have to pass. If it's not nationally significant according to the National Historic Landmark criteria, then the study is not even completed. The effort ends right at that national significance period. And to be quite honest with you, when I was called in to work specifically on evaluating the national significance, many of my colleagues and superiors assumed that because this was a vernacular site and that is not documented in any books that are written about Dr. Martin Luther King or other civil rights leaders, that it was automatically not nationally significant. Next slide, please. Well, I knew enough about his most prolific pastor, Ralph David Abernathy, to know better. But I knew that it would take approaching doing the research from a different standpoint than just visiting local libraries to find documentation to confirm this. Abernathy is often mentioned as King's confidant, and that's it. However, he was the co-founder of the Montgomery Improvement Association and helped co-lead the Montgomery bus boycott, which helped propel the dismantling of segregation in the South. Abernathy served as the leader of the SCLC, secretary treasurer, and following Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, he was president of that organization. During the late 60s through mid 70s, Abernathy helped the SCLC expand its focus from desegregation to include universal human rights issues such as economic justice and labor rights. And from 61 to 73, Abernathy served as full-time pastor at West Hunter Street Baptist Church while being engaged in his most prolific years as a civil rights leader. So our office was not too culturally competent in being quick to be dismissive of the history of West Hunter Street Baptist Church and Ralph David Abernathy. Next slide, please. For this special resource study, I decided to put more emphasis on the public comment process and targeting members of the West Atlanta community and the congregation of West Hunter. I knew that there may not be a lot of documentation on the site in terms of a lot of the legal documents that Melissa alluded to in her presentation or within books. But the history of the site was still there. It was just walking around on two legs, embodied in the people that had been active in the civil rights movement, that were members of the congregation and members of the community. So there were two meetings instead of the one standard public comment meeting that the Park Service normally has for these studies. And we made sure to arrange for them to take place in the community. What we heard at these meetings is that, yeah, people felt that Ralph David Abernathy, his activism, and the history of his work was important. And contrary to sometimes popular stereotype, they also wanted the physical building to be preserved, especially in the wake of developments taking place on Atlanta's west side. They were more concerned about us really capturing Dr. Abernathy's contributions to the movement and how this church became a satellite for civil rights organizing during his time pastoring there. At the second public meeting, the congregation of West Hunter challenged us to be forthright about the Park Service's intent and whether it was just to have our meeting to check off a box and move on, or if we really were sincere in wanting to learn more information about the site and why it was significant beyond just the brick and mortar, by engaging the people who knew the history and were carrying it around inside them. And of course, myself and some of my other team members were like, absolutely. So members of the congregation then helped us organize an oral history day at West Hunter Baptist Church. And we were able to conduct oral history interviews with groups of members by age range, starting from those in their 60s and working up to the oldest member, who was 93 at the time. I was also able to conduct interviews with members of the Abernathy family and SDLC members that work closely with him, like Terry Randolph, John Reynolds, and the late civil rights activist, Dr. Lonnie King. Next slide, please. From these interviews, I was able to gather more research information about Abernathy's work as leader of the SCLC after King's assassination, particularly in the areas of labor rights and political representation that helped change the Southern elections in the early 70s. I also learned that the church had a history of civil rights organizing long before Abernathy through pastors like A. Franklin Fisher, pictured on the upper right corner of the slide. Dr. Fisher was a part of a group of pastors here in Atlanta who successfully demonstrated and sued the city of Atlanta to desegregate public transit here. Even after Abernathy moved his congregation from the site in 1973, he still permitted it to be used for civil rights activity and political organizing. It was the office for the Atlanta chapter of the SCLC, led by Hosea Williams, who's pictured in the lower right-hand corner, and an office for Maynard Jackson's mayoral campaign. Next slide, please. So from those efforts, where we started out with an office that assumed, because there was no documentation readily available on this site, that it must not be nationally significant, to just understanding and incorporating time to take into account more Eastern or African views on preservation and preservation methods, such as the oral history, we were able to get enough information to establish that the site was nationally significant. Number one, for its association with Dr. Abernathy, and then number two, for the civil rights activities that took place that we were able to document through oral history collection. Now I want to segue a bit into education, because that's another important piece that we often miss as preservation professionals, and it's also another barrier. For African Americans and other communities of color, the preservation field and movement are experienced through and as displacement and gentrification. So you cannot take for granted, if you're a professional, that community organizations know what this discipline is. In order for your programs to be successful at preserving resources in African American communities, it is necessary that the stewards of these resources have an understanding of historic preservation and cultural resource management as disciplines. Next slide, please. It does not take a major program to do this like we often assume. It simply means allotting a little extra time in your discussions or in your planning format for education. An example may be providing a few minutes prior to or at the beginning of a meeting to familiarize the individuals that you're addressing with the nomenclature that you will be using, basic preservation methods, federal standards, state and federal processes and programs at various levels that are common to the discipline. I often hear my colleagues and coworkers complain that communities are not taking advantage of specific program or funding source. But then when I go out and I start asking community leaders and resource stewards if they know about these programs, the answer is often no. Or if they do know about them and are interested, they are not familiar enough with the discipline to know how to start developing a project to meet their needs. Right now, the National Park Service Washington Support Office runs a civil rights. I'm sorry, did someone have a question? Or was that just background noise? Okay.
It was just background noise.
Thank you, Melissa. Right now, the National Park Service Washington Support Office runs a civil rights grant fund where resources related to the civil rights movement can apply for up to $500,000 for brick and mortar preservation projects. The first intake year I served on the review committee, and there were only about 150 applicants nationwide. Mind-blowing. Only 3 applicants per state on an average. So if you say, okay, civil rights is mostly Southern states, that's only 9 applicants per the 16 states that constitute what we know as the South. people did not know about this program. And that's because we did not go out and educate them on it and promote it. Those that did know had a need, but many were unfamiliar with the discipline and had challenges in planning their projects. So this is an example of why it's important for us to not assume that when we are working with these communities that they are familiar with what we are talking about, that they are familiar with organizations or like the State Historic Preservation Office, that they know what a historic tax credit program is. A little bit of time, like I said, before and after, or maybe put together a fact sheet to be able to share with them. The goal should not just be to accomplish your project, but the goal should be when your project is done, you have left that owner a better steward and manager of the resource that they own. West Hunter Street is also a good example of this need for providing education and access to information for our stewards. Mrs. Annette Abernathy, who is the current owner of West Hunter Street, found out about this fund source, and through the assistance of a local architect, was able to start planning a phased approach to address stabilization and damage needs for the building. And when she had questions about methods or where to find information, she and I would just have what I call a coffee chat, where I just sat and provided info in a very informal way. Next slide, please. So since 2017, through the knowledge that she was able to gain as a steward of that church, she has been successful in applying to and receiving a substantial amount of grant money. And as you look at the picture here, you see she is stabilizing the church. She's not waiting on the Park Service special resource study results. She's not waiting on anyone to come and save the church for her. She is now a steward of her resource, and she is now such a great advocate. The Park Service will often get her to speak and use her as an example on social media of successes for their African American Civil Rights Grant Program. So through sharing information and education, you can help resource owners become more responsible and knowledgeable. And by incorporating the education piece into our programs, we ultimately build stewardship capacity and advocates for preservation within African American communities that will be able to reach audiences that we won't have the time or capability to reach as a professional. Next slide, please. And the West Hunter congregants who were interviewed also became advocates for preservation and for the continued study of the site. Through their oral history interviews, a lot of them brought forth documentation that they were willing to share with the National Park Service that greatly assisted with the research necessary to complete the national significance evaluation. I do not believe we would have been able to obtain this documentation had we approached the research with the same paternalistic bureaucratic process that we normally use as an organization. And what you're looking at on the screen are two photo documentations that we were able to obtain through oral history. Someone came forth to show us, to give us a photo of the church from 1953 after its first major rehabilitation. And then someone was able to share with us architectural renderings from 1973 when the church moved to its current location on Ralph David Abernathy Boulevard and considered immediately prior to that redeveloping the church into the concept drawing that you see on the right. Next slide, please. The The Park Service is currently completing another special resource study evaluating civil rights sites in Mississippi that could be potential national park units. As I've gone through several tours of the state with my colleagues, I'm wondering if the lessons learned from West Hunter have been understood. How will the Park Service evaluate sites like the Bryant store in Money, Mississippi, which does not readily meet the NHL criteria? But this is the store where Emmett Till was falsely accused of sexually harassing a local white woman. And as anyone would conclude, of course, this is nationally and internationally significant. Next slide, please. Will they utilize the living history, walking around on 2 feet above ground to understand vernacular sites and landscapes of memory, like the homestead of civil rights leader in Hattiesburg NAACP President Vernon Dahmer? You see his youngest son pictured here, recounting for Park Service staff the night in 1966 when 2 carloads of Klansmen attacked him and his family. As one community member stated in her challenge to the National Park Service during a public meeting in Mississippi, 2 years is not enough time, and a Mississippi stroll is not enough time to invest in these important and significant events. Next slide, please. So I challenge those of us who are historic preservation professionals. Knowing what I've shared with you now about the need to understand different cultural views to approach how we plan our work with African American and other communities of color, what will your organization do? Business as usual, or will we move forward by reaching out and broadening our perspective? And I'll add this challenge to African American resource owners. What will you do? Will you commit to educating yourselves, consulting preservation professionals for help in areas that you don't understand, and ensure that you learn and practice processes to help develop sustainable programs that merge African American cultural views with Western practices to preserve tangible resources? We have to meet each other halfway. Thank you so much. And that concludes my presentation this morning.
Thank you so much, Keilah. Well, I think everyone can agree what gift both Keilah Spann and Melissa Jest are to us in Georgia. It's so great to have these 2 wonderful women working in our state, doing the great job that they're doing, and being willing to share it with us today. So thank you both. And Keilah, I just realized from hearing your presentation, what a silo I live in, because I did not have any idea of the work you had done documenting the historic West Hunter Street Church. As you probably know, and many of you may not know, the Georgia Trust holds a preservation easement on the historic West Hunter Street Church. And I don't believe that it would have been eligible for the grant or the easement that we're holding had you not done the work. So thank you so much for doing that. I just want to acknowledge that, because I think I just assumed that it was eligible, and that was apparent to everyone. I had no idea that you had to do that diligent outreach and reach back into oral history to make it happen. So thank you so much for that. So we're going to now have some time for questions before we break for lunch. And I think we can do those orally. Let me see. We can actually get Danielle, I think, to recognize people. So Danielle, would you go ahead and start recognizing people if they have questions?
Absolutely. So is everyone seeing Keilah and Melissa's contact information on the screen?
Yes.
Okay. Keilah, I believe this is your updated information. Is that correct?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. All right. If anyone has questions, you can select the raise hand option and I will call on folks. Or if you want to go ahead and put something in the chat box and let me know that you have a question, I can call on you and then you can unmute yourself and ask your question. Okay. I see a question from Katie Nelson. Katie, if you want to verbally ask your question, you're welcome to unmute and do so. I will go ahead and just ask the question and pose it. Could you use family histories of other families as requisite documentation, such as the landowners or slave owners?
And the question was, can you use family history as an oral history documentation for
Yes.
to support? Yeah.
I think it's specifically, could you use family histories of other
families? Yes.
as requisite documentation, such as landowners or slave owners?
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Tate is asking, how can we support the Georgia African American Historic Preservation Network, Melissa?
Oh, well, thank you for that question, Dr. Tate. GOPN, as we call it for short, has been around since 1989. So they've been around for a while. Started out as a small group of concerned advocates who saw that numerous African-American sites were being lost because they weren't receiving attention from the State Historic Preservation Office. And so they approached our office here, the current SHPO at the time, Liz Lyon, and said, you need to be educated about what's happening out here. And now they've been able to grow through the creation of the Reflections newsletter to more than 2,500 people around the state. And what we say is that if you are concerned about African-American preservation or currently participating in preserving or promoting an African-American site, you are a part of the network. You probably just don't know it. So fortunately, we are in 2020 moving into an effort to engage more directly with the members of this network, this loose network. We have a steering board of about 10 representatives who are professional historians, grassroots advocates, educators, and they will be kind of leading this effort to formalize a network, formalize a structure. And we will be getting advice from the Georgia Trust, which is our statewide preservation organization, on how do you engage on a statewide level. So what I would ask people to do is to take down my contact information, to send me an email and say they are interested in learning more about GOPN and possibly participating in some of the programming that we will have in 2021. Our very first one, where we will be inviting some portion of the network to participate with the board, is in February. So I look forward to kind of fielding those questions, and also would encourage folks who are doing a preservation project and they haven't touched bases with me or they haven't signed up for Reflections to send me an email and become a part of our contact list. That way we are able to push out information to you once we have more programming. So thank you for that.
Great, thanks, Melissa. Clarification on email addresses there, Melissa. I believe your DNR email may still go through. Is that correct? You're on mute, Melissa.
Thank you. Through the end of this month, December 31st. So thank you for that. Let me make that clarification. The Georgia Historic Preservation Division, as Mark mentioned on the intro, is now under the Department of Community Affairs. We have moved from the Department of Natural Resources, DNR, to that we are now under DCA, Department of Community Affairs. And that will be effective, my new email will be effective January 1st, and that will be melissa.jest@dca.ga.gov. So instead of DNR, it would be DCA. So thank you for that reminder, Danielle.
And we will send out a follow-up email, and we'll make sure to include all that updated contact info. So we'll make sure that Melissa's updated email is included with that. And there is an example there in the chat if anyone needs it. We did get a question about more written examples of different fundraising ideas, and we are going to speak a little bit more to fundraising after lunch. So after we go through that portion of the agenda, if you still have questions about fundraising, we can certainly address them at that time. Okay. Keilah has also offered some information through the National Park Service's website regarding state, tribal, local plans and grants. So you can find that on their website. Any additional questions?
Melissa, this is Ben. I have a question for you, not to put you on the spot, but do you have, I think you spoke really eloquently about how advocates for particular sites can sort of keep getting their name out there and be active in the community and sort of put a face to the resource with the example of joining the Chamber of Commerce and things like that. Do you have any sort of general recommendations for folks that might have not done that before, but are interested in trying to take that step?
How to ease into it, so to speak?
Yeah, or just sort of best practices when you're communicating with people about your resource, or as general as you'd like to be.
Okay. Well, that's a good point. What I often advise people to do is, of course, make an outline, make a handout. I think Keilah pointed to that as well, so that you have the specific talking points that you want to get across. We often refer to that elevator speech. If you're in the elevator with, a big donor that you've been trying to contact for months, and now you only have 30 seconds before he gets to his floor or she gets to her floor, and you want to talk about your project. To create something very succinct, but very, very clear and to the point as to why someone else would care about your resource, about your effort. So yes, I do try to encourage people to write it down. What is the resource? Why is it significant? What you need from the individual that you're speaking with, and why they should care. So yes, that would be the first thing. Make that notation for yourself. And the second thing would be to open up your mind about who you want to include. So a little bit of thinking and pre-planning, so that when you go through your list of who I want to contact, who I think can make a difference, be diverse in that. And don't think it only has to be a historian or only has to be an academic institution. As the Hubbard alumni realized, we need to get in front of these businesses. So they joined the Chamber of Commerce. And so think a little more broadly about other community groups or segments of the community that can contribute to your project, so that you're diverse in that. And then you can make those cold calls, or if they have, public meeting opportunities, you can go to those meetings with your elevator speech, either memorized on an index card, written in your hand, whatever works for you, so that you can get in front of the face of people and talk about your project. So more importantly, just to be open-minded and be inclusive in who or what organizations can contribute and support your project. Think outside the box. Sorry to use that pun. But those would be the two general kind of suggestions I would make.
Thank you.
Oh, sure, thank you.
So I've got more of an observation than a question, but I just want to say I agree with Keilah and Melissa that that when they say that it's a myth that African Americans are not concerned about preservation, because they really are. And I think the Georgia Trust Places in Peril program is a great evidence of that. So those of you who don't know about that program, every year the Georgia Trust in the fall releases a list of the 10 sites in Georgia we consider to be the most significant sites that are in imminent threat of demolition or loss. And we've been doing this for 16 years now. And for the past, I'd say 8 or 10 years, we've seen a very definite rise in the number of applications we're getting from the African-American community to try to bring attention to the plight of historic African-American sites. Last year, I think 6 out of the 10 sites that we selected were African-American history related. And I think this year, there half of them, if I'm not mistaken, maybe more than that, were African-American sites. So it's working. We're getting the word out. It may be a symptom of the fact that there are more sites in danger, but I believe it's deeper than that. I think it's because there's more awareness and people are concerned about these sites. So I think we're happy with that. We want to take it to the next level, of course. So for that, we do need more participation. We need more fundraising efforts on these sites. And so we're going to get into that in the afternoon and talk about fundraising a little bit more. So that's really good news for the movement. And I do commend these 2 fine folks who've spoken to us this morning. The leadership of the trust is stepping up. Dr. Candy Tate went on our board last year. She's been a real leader in the movement, and she's working very, very hard on a number of projects. Ashby Street Theater was put on the list this year, and Candy's working on that. And she's also at the same time working on Fountain Hall at Morris Brown College. So Candy, thank you for that as well.
And if I could jump in, I know that Danielle, you noted that someone had a question about fundraising, because people want to find out, how can I get the money? Yeah, show me the money. that movie. What I wanted to say to that is that as a grassroots organization, or as a fledgling group, or even if you've been around for a while, you have to do some self-assessment, some internal kind of assessment as to your capacity to handle the wonderful, abundance that's going to come your way when you start on this effort, because we want to speak positively, right? So you got to prepare for the success. You got to prepare for the response. You got to do some self-assessment first. So I would encourage folks, as they think about, where this money is going to come from, think about what structure you have to manage the money. What structure do you have to manage the project? Investigate your capacity first. I use the analogy of the hole in your hand. So you can successfully ask for money and successfully receive it, but if you haven't closed the hole in your hand, it's going to fall through and not be available for you to really use on your effort. So that's a little tidbit I would share, in preparation for our discussion on fundraising later.
Thank you, Melissa. I'd like to piggyback on that important point Melissa brought up. Not just making sure that you have built a program that has the capacity to handle dollars and to execute a program, but what I have seen is that people do not put in a succession plan with their organizations. So the organization is usually built by and revolves around one very dynamic leader. And in my experience, a lot of these leaders are coming from the civil rights era. That person retires or that person passes on. And because they and the organization have not put in plan succession, the program ends with them. And, that is certainly a shame. I've seen it happen time and time again, where all the successes that an organization makes under one leader, you come back 5, 10 years after that leader has stepped down or passed on, and things are in shambles and they're back where they started from. And early in my career, I worked on a preservation effort where the state of South Carolina gave $250,000 for a historic cemetery. And I worked and planned with the city of Columbia, South Carolina, to have the cemetery restored. We restored the cemetery. And 10 years later, I go back home to visit my family, and they tell me, do not go to that cemetery. You will have a heart attack. That's because there was no succession plan. When the leadership that I worked with turned over, they did not plan to educate and bring people on board who would give sustained life to maintaining the site. So that is very important. I also want to mention, and I mentioned this in my presentation, that the National Park Service has the African American Civil Rights Fund Source. For brick and mortar preservation projects, you can apply for up to $500,000. They also offer planning and interpretation dollars through the same fund source, and you can ask for up to $75,000. There is no match requirement. Let me say that again. There is no match requirement. So this is one of the few fund sources out here where you can get that much money. That's a substantial amount of money for brick and mortar preservation, and you do not have to have cash or in kind. And like I said during my presentation, that first year I was shocked at how few people applied. They've extended this year's deadline to mid-January. If you go to type in what I posted in, look up information, it is the African American Civil Rights Grant Fund Source. If you are trying to build your program, if you plan your program or plan projects in a phased approach and apply each year, this is an excellent way to get funding for your projects, funding to develop programming around interpretation, or funding to just help with planning. So I hope, if you're not ready to take advantage, share with another organization or a resource owner who is. And I really hope that everyone is listening to what Melissa said about being prepared, and also putting succession plan in place, because your program and maintaining a resource should outlive you.
Excellent, Keilah. And you brought to mind a point that, I'll just kind of mention here that we may not have time to get into with this program, but possibly with the Georgia African American Historic Preservation Network, GOPN, that might be a platform where we can expand on this discussion. But we need to engage the next two generations. As you mentioned, a lot of elders are leading organizations concerned with history because they experienced it, or they're one generation removed from those who experienced that particular that significant period. However, under our tradition of sharing our history orally, we have stopped talking to the following generations. We have stopped taking that past knowledge and experience and moving it forward. And so, I'm really, really curious. And like I said, we may not have time to get into it here, but I'm really looking forward to an opportunity to understand from our elders, from the founders of these various organizations and entities, what is it that we and the next generations have to do to prove to you that we are ready to take the baton? What do we need to do to assure you that your legacy, that your work, that this effort will continue? Because I've seen interested young folks. I've met interested young folks, but there's a disconnect. They are not connected with those entities and organizations that have been towing the line. There's a disconnect. And so I really would encourage us, that's another barrier that we have, this disconnect within our communities, based on between the generations, based on age. That's something that we got to talk about, and we've got to get over. The young folks can be folded into efforts, I believe, And that would support succession planning. But we've got to answer that question. Why are we not engaging our young folks? Sure, it takes effort. Sure, young folks can get a little messy. Sure, they can, exhaust your patience. Sure, but those things can be overcome. They were born into our families, born into our communities. We need to see them not only as the future, but we need to see them as, assets we need to invest in. Just like the sites, that we're concerned about, we need to invest in them as well. So I'll get off my soapbox. I look forward to an opportunity to talk and understand a little bit more of how we can surmount that barrier. Thank you.
Well, since you're getting off the soapbox, I'd like to get back up on it. Because I want to assure everybody, this may sound obvious, but this is not an issue that is limited to the African-American community. This is a big, gigantic issue for the overall historic preservation movement, but it's also an issue for virtually every arts organization, the symphony, the opera, museums, all across America, that we're just not attracting the next generation of people to hand the baton to. So Melissa, I love your slide and your language, this overt outreach. I think that is something we have to do. It's not something that we should do. It's not something we ought to do. It's something we have to do because there's absolutely no reason to put forth all this effort in preservation if we don't do it. Because if we spend a lot of money restoring a building and we don't have someone to commit to maintaining it, then it really is just sort of a exercise in futility. So one of the things that the Georgia Trust has done is we have established a sub-organization called Inherit Georgia, which is a group of under 40 people under 40 that we subsidize. And we use the gifts of our older people to create events for young people to get them involved in historic preservation. I'm proud to say it is a very integrated organization, Inherit Georgia is. So I think that every preservation group, every local museum site, every cultural site needs to have an overt outreach effort to bring in the next generation. It's absolutely a necessity.
I want to acknowledge, I've seen a couple of questions about starting oral history projects. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go into detail around that. And before I give my hard answer to that, I do want to say, like what Mark and Melissa are talking about, this common problem of engaging the next generation. Oral histories are a way to do that. I find that young people like sitting down and being able to use technology, which they're so great at, to record people. So that is one activity that can be used to get younger people talking to older generations, is by having them interview them. Also, we are very good, if you look at, and this is across the board, it doesn't matter what your race is. I like to use sororities and fraternities as an example. They're very good at having the older generation reach back with these common activities around bringing them on board into fraternity or sorority. And I'm not a member of a sorority, so for those of you that are, chime in. But they do a lot of community activities that are able to bring multiple generations together. That's something that preservation organizations can do. When I was in Louisiana, I saw that the King River community, which is one of our premier cultural groups there, they did a great job in making sure young people were engaged with community activities, whether it was fishing, whether it was trail rides. That was an equestrian community. So one of their values was the land and horse riding. They were always engaging young people with learning how to ride horses, learning how to hunt, learning how to do traditional boar trapping. So there are community activities that you can do. If you're in an urban area, you can just engage young people in community cleanup, which a lot of people don't realize. You talk about a basic preservation method. Cleaning up the trash in your community is the first step to preserving it. Trash sits around and collects water, and trash around a building will collect water that will, over time cause moisture damage to your building. So community cleanup days are a great day to get young people and multiple generations involved in maintaining their community. As to oral histories, let me first point you to great resources. Baylor University has a great oral history program. You should go to their website and look for their oral history program. University of North Carolina is another one. If you want to start an oral history program and planning a project, first really think about what information do you want to gain. So don't just sit down and start recording people for the sake of just recording them, unless it's somebody who's 100 years old and not going to be around too much longer. But think about what you want to get from this person. So come up with a focus and a theme that way, and then use that to start writing out your line of question. Do your background research on that person and try to do it as in a timeline from their birth, getting facts, but then also getting major points about their lives throughout like the timeline up to the current moment. So I hope that kind of helps in how to get started. If you want more technical information, you have my email address. That's the best way to reach out to me, and I will respond.
And then Keilah, we also had a recommendation in the chat, somebody who's used the StoryCorps program and organization before, which if anybody listens to NPR, they use StoryCorps at least once a week, I think. But for those of you in the Atlanta area, once the pandemic is over, we actually have a local StoryCorps studio at the Atlanta History Center. So that's another good resource.
And also in the Atlanta region area, there's the Oral History Association. They used to be housed at Georgia State University. Now I think they're housed at Kennesaw. But you can Google Oral History Association, and they can share with you some of their handouts on best practices, and also how to draft questions, how to organize themes, as Keilah was mentioning, so that when you do have these conversations, you are able to bring out of the interviewee the information that you're really looking for to help with your documentation or to help with your nomination or the information that you're really trying to get. So the Oral History Association, I think, is headquartered at Kennesaw State and can provide you with some guidelines.
So just a follow-up comment there that StoryCorps does have an app that folks can use during the pandemic. And then Keilah and Melissa, I'm not sure if you saw, but Robin Morris is on from Agnes Scott and has students who would be very interested in working with you guys. And then also that they are a great source of interns and research assistants. So that's another thing to think about too. If you have institutions around you, that's always a resource in terms of students that you can utilize. University of Georgia, the Savannah College of Art and Design, Georgia State. There are multiple programs that have history and historic preservation throughout our state who could also offer their resources and services. All right. We have just a few more minutes. We're a little bit ahead of schedule. If anyone has any additional questions, again, certainly feel free to put those in the chat, or you can ask verbally. You can turn off your mute and ask. We'll just try not to have people overlapping if we do so. Okay, seeing none. I think we can go ahead. We will wrap up at this point for our lunch break. So we will reconvene at 1:30. If anyone has any closing remarks, you can go ahead and chime in with those now. But otherwise, just go ahead and use this same link or the button that you received in the email to rejoin us at 1:30 p.m. All right. Thanks. And we look forward to seeing y'all then.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.